need to use this time to think. We're not going back, but where are we going? What do we want for our planet, our communities, our future? If we don't answer this question, it will be answered for us and blame shifted from the powerful to the powerless. We need each other now. We need to reflect and reset, strategize, organize, assemble, collective power. This is a network. Join, claim the future.
There's lots of people coming in at the moment, so we'll just give it a minute before we start. We've had just over 1,000 register to join us this evening. Okay, Kent. I think I'm unmuted now. Right, okay, we've got lots of people still coming in, but let's make a start because we're fairly tight on time tonight. Let me welcome all to this launch of our new project. We've called it Claim the Future. So thanks for joining us. I'll try and briefly explain the background and purpose of the project before I introduce a panel of my friends who are going to speak this evening. And I just want to say thanks to our speakers who are coming from New Zealand, from India, from New York in the States and London. We're living in a time like few others. It's a traumatic period for many that have been directly and too often tragically who suffered loss and harm from the coronavirus outbreak. But it's also a period of potentially dramatic economic and political upheaval as people lose their jobs and many sink into debt. And also the underlying principles of how our economies operate are being forcibly challenged as a result. So when people are faced with uncertainty and insecurity like this, there's a natural tendency to want to cling to the past, to wish for things to return to what was, well, normal. That's why the slogan "Build Back Better" has had an attractive appeal. And it's also, though, why it's been so readily co-opted by conservatives like Boris Johnson. But you know, it's interesting that the crisis that we're going through has largely bucked this trend. Polling is demonstrating that most people do not want to go back to the way we were. They want to build better, but not back. It's because the normal that existed for so many was far from good. The pre-pandemic normal for most was the product of 10 years of austerity, a decade in which our essential services like the NHS and social care were deprived of the resources they desperately needed, and a decade of year-on-year of wages cut and frozen, and work increasingly insecure, stressed, and yes, for many, under pressure. The grotesque neoliberal mismanagement of our economy left our public services so ill prepared for coping with the virus when it hit. It left so many people incapable of avoiding immediate financial hardship when the pandemic struck. So it's completely understandable, as far as I'm concerned, that people do not want to return to the insecurity and the precariousness of that past normality. Of course, the vast bulk of our attention is naturally focused on coping with, surviving, and getting through the pandemic. But at the back, I believe at the back of the collective mind is that nagging thought that coronavirus is not the only threat we face. And for all the frightening scale of hurt and damage that the virus is causing, well, COVID pales into relative insignificance beside the existential risk of climate catastrophe that we now face. That's why we can't allow a return to normal. We can't let establishment political leaders and their corporate and media allies take us back, because that will put us at risk all over again. So we must claim the future. We have to ask and answer the questions about what lives we want to live, what communities we want to live in, and what future there should be for our planet. If we don't, others will. And it will be the establishment politicians and their corporate controllers that will answer the questions for us. I heard that wonderful writer and campaigner, Arundhati Roy, describe the pandemic as a portal through which we can step into a new future. That's what this project is all about. It's about releasing our collective imagination to consider what the new future could be. But more importantly, it's about networking that thinking with the action and the activists working to secure the change that we desire. Now, there are some who've been arguing that this is not the time to be promoting new ideas or policies about the way we manage our economy or organize our society. They argue it's best simply to criticize the performance of, for example, the Conservatives here and the status quo elsewhere. And when asked that question, if you don't like what Boris Johnson is doing, what would you do? The response has been from some not to say or to say very little. Largely on the grounds, I've heard the argument that, well, in this country, the election is a long way off. I completely understand that. I completely understand that. There will be a time for constructing a manifesto later. So I completely understand and respect that response. But there is a positive role for many of us that we can play in instigating a constructive discussion about the society we want to create and some of the policy ideas possible to lay the foundations of that new society. If there is at least one lesson I've urged people to take from the horrendous defeat Labour experienced in the 2019 election, is that ideas and policy programmes must be set in an overall narrative, a narrative of the vision of the society we aim to create. And you need time to bed them in and convince people of the role these policies will play within that overall narrative, the role individual policies will play to achieve the vision of that society we seek to create. I also have to say that at a time when so many are recognizing the need for change, if progressives don't seize the opportunity to put forward the type of change we want, well, we have to say, if we can't answer that question now, when will it ever be the right time? I'll take you through just briefly the work we've undertaken in preparation for this project and our ideas on the process from here on. I want to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for the support it's provided to enable me to bring together a small team who over the last couple of months have been drafting a series of policy position papers on some of the most pressing economic issues facing our society. They range from climate change to the operation of finance capital to taxation, public services, public ownership, and many, many others. The team has brought together for each topic a range of policy experts and researchers and progressive thinkers and the progressive think tanks, and also activist campaigns to peer review the papers they've produced, but also to throw in ideas for both policy development, but also, as importantly, the type of campaigning we need to undertake to secure the implementation of those policies. To be honest, it's been quite exhilarating listening, just been an exhilarating listening project overall. Just listening to the buzz of well thought through and grounded ideas, and importantly, to the incredibly creative and yes, at times so often courageous campaigners in the various fields. It's just, to be frank, it's just set me alight in terms of the enthusiasm that's being shown. Our intention is to release the individual papers over the next couple of months for discussion and to convene online meetings to launch and explore the ideas that are contained in them and plan support for actions around them. We'll aim to put the various proposals from these individual papers together in the early autumn, hopefully as an alternative economic strategy for discussion, but as I say, as importantly for campaigning. The most important role is to link the development and the promotion of new thinking with the campaigning and action on the ground. So, welcome to the concept of praxis, theory and practice in action. This is a sizable and challenging project to pull off. And yeah, we might fall flat on our faces, but the political climate at the moment is too serious not to try. My underlying fear is a repeat of what happened after the banking crash in 2008, when the left left a vacuum that the right steadily filled. The result was 10 years of brutal austerity in this country, that we know didn't just cause hardship, but actually cost many, many lives. And the result was a recession that hit so many families and undermined their well-being. And we could be facing a further recession now. And those recessions are often the breeding ground, not just for the right, but in some instances for the far right. That's why we need this project to work. The first part of our listening project was to listen to the way people had learnt and what they'd learnt from the pandemic experience about the values they held and the values which they felt should underlie our society in the future. What came across was just how much we cared for one another, but also how much we need one another. Basic values of humanity and solidarity that should underpin how we live together in the future. People have described the scale of the challenges we face in every field if we're to build the economy and the society that we need. The policy papers we'll be releasing over the next 3 months will address many of those key issues. But there are some immediate issues that need to be addressed urgently, particularly in this country. Next Sunday marks the 75th anniversary of the Attlee government taking office. In the ruins of just after the Second World War, with debt far higher than today, that government didn't offer a meal deal. They founded the NHS. They created the welfare state. They built the council homes, and they nationalised 1/3 of our industry. They claimed the future, and so must we. The time has come, I believe, to complete some of the unfinished business of the Attlee government. Thanks largely to the underfunding by successive Tory governments and the ownership of much of our care services being in the hands of hedge funds and venture capitalists and backed by private equity sucking resources from the sector, our care services have been stretched to the absolute limit. And with another spike in the virus highly possible, it's time now to act decisively and create the caring service that we need. We need the urgent nationalisation of care to establish the National Care Service alongside the National Health Service. We believe only in this way we'll be able to secure the standard of care we wish for our elderly and disabled, and ensure that the care workforce are properly respected, supported and rewarded. Other urgent issues have to be addressed as well. The precarity facing workers has been exposed as the furlough scheme ends and unemployment now is beginning to soar. Even before the pandemic, the economy was stagnant and wages no higher than a decade ago. That's why we need an immediate minimum income guarantee. But we also need to deal with the escalating mountain of personal debt. We'll be bringing forward radical proposals to tackle the debt crisis. But we'll also support all those campaigners and experts who are demonstrating the scale of determination, radical policy making and resourcing needed to tackle climate change as one of our central focuses. So just before I introduce my friends and to conclude, I just want to say this. I believe this is a pivotal moment in history. Over the last few years, populist politics led by charlatan politicians backed by corporate wealth, both here and in the United States, have taken over. The pandemic has exposed that type of politics and those politicians for what they are: bombastic, dangerous, incompetence. People have paid for the likes of Johnson and Trump with their lives, and many more now with their jobs and their livelihoods. But the pandemic has also revealed how our current economic system also fails us. It's putting us at risk of an even greater catastrophe of climate change. So our project aims to ensure that the lessons that are learned from the pandemic that can be carried forward to enable us to tackle the fundamental threat of climate change, that we contribute to creating an unstoppable climate of opinion. We've been working with dozens of different activists and campaign groups to claim the future, to give confidence to others, to open up a political door that maybe the post-election defeat timidity that was created may be preventing some from walking through at the moment. I hope that having listened to our speakers tonight, you'll join our network. It's a network for action, and we're launching it tonight. And we're basically saying we cannot go back. We cannot go back. We must claim the future. So thanks for coming this evening. Please go to our website after this meeting and click on and join us and participate in the coming months in the discussions and the activities that will be taking place. But tonight, I'm really pleased. As I say, I've got a group of friends really who are going to speak. And I just want to thank them for participating. Our first speaker is Joseph Stiglitz. Look, Joe and I have worked together in recent years. Let me go through the formal introduction so everyone is aware of the range of work he's done. All of you, I'm sure, will know some of this. Joe, as you know, is an American economist. He's a public policy analyst. He's a professor at the moment at Columbia University. His CV is just extraordinary. I know he's going to be embarrassed at me saying this, but he's just extraordinary. He's, as you know, he's a recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. He served as Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the World Bank and is Chairman of the US Council of Economic Advisors. He's known for his criticism of global institutions such as the IMF and World Bank and of laissez-faire economists, whom he calls free market fundamentalists. I tell you, it's just an honor to have him join us from New York this evening. I just want to say personally the thanks for all the advice and support he's given me personally over recent years, but also just for being a light in the darkness at times when it's been tough times in having some of these debates. Thanks, Joe, for joining us.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to, this evening, echo many of the themes that John has put forward. Perhaps the place to begin is the point that we need to claim the future, and there's no going back. Never have governments provided the level of funding to the economy that we've seen since the COVID-19. And the fact that the public, citizens, have provided this funding means that it is their right, I think, to claim, or you might say, shape the future. The decisions of who gets the money, the conditions under which the money is given, is going to shape the economy, shape our society for coming years. And as we do that, we ought to be thinking more about what kind of society and what kind of economy we want. The point that John made couldn't be more clear. The economy, the society that we had in January 2020 was not ideal. And the pandemic has in many ways exposed and, unless we do something, aggravated these weaknesses. It was an economy that was based on massive inequalities in every dimension: income, wealth, health. In the United States, where we don't have even, we don't recognize the right of access to healthcare, enormous disparities in health, access to justice, and across numerous fissures in our society, including race and ethnicity. It was a society and economy based, as it has been for the last couple hundred years, on fossil fuels, endangering the future of our planet. It was an old, you might say, manufacturing economy. Manufacturing is an important part, but it's not the economy of the future. It wasn't based on care. It wasn't based on knowledge. And so I think we have to take this moment where we've seen things not working so well to reshape our economy and our society. Now, let me comment on some of the ways, besides the massive inequalities, that the pandemic has exposed the weaknesses. When there's a problem of the magnitude of COVID-19, of the pandemic, we inevitably turn to government. We do that in the case of floods, fires. We turn to government to collective action. And unfortunately, 40 years of denigrating the role of government, beginning with Thatcher in the UK, Reagan in the United States, has left the government unprepared, unable to fulfill the roles that it needs to play. In the United States, under President Obama, there was a recognition of the threat of pandemics. We had been warned. We had been warned by SARS, by MERS, by Ebola, and Obama had set up a White House Office of Preparedness for Pandemics. But then President Trump disbanded that, defunded the government agency that is designed to respond, the Centers for Disease Control, allowed our stockpiles to be depleted. And so when the pandemic struck, we were not well prepared. But I think equally striking was the recognition that our private sector was not robust. Our private sector was not resilient. 40 years of neoliberalism had not only devastated the public sector, but it actually had weakened the private sector. And that was because this idea, I said, as John mentioned, I call it sometimes market fundamentalism, but it's not a real market economy. It was a market economy based on exploitation. It was a market economy based on short-term thinking, short-termism, where finance triumphed over everything. I sometimes put it, we built cars without spare tires, thinking that we were saving money. But of course, when you have a flat tire, you realize how important the spare tire is. So we constructed market economies that were not resilient. And that has left us in a state unprepared to deal with the pandemic. Now, as we've seen different countries respond to the pandemic across the world, we've seen some that have done very well and some done very poorly. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what are the characteristics of those who have done well and those that have done more poorly. And among the characteristics are the strong government that I referred to. Among the characteristics are a trust not only in government, but also in the private sector. One of the problems we've had in the United States is that we cannot trust the private sector to provide the tests that we need, let alone produce them. The problem is that scamming is a part of life in America. So if you have a test and the test is not tested, somebody will produce a test that doesn't work, jeopardizing the lives of the people who rely on those tests. So we have a private sector that is not working. In countries like New Zealand, where there was more trust, they were able to not only control the disease, but bring it basically down to zero. And because they could bring the disease under control, they began a process of restarting the economy. Well, that sets the stage for an important point that John emphasized. We have to have a philosophy. We have to have an understanding of views, of values, of what kind of economy and what kind of society we want to construct. Neoliberalism was a set of views. It was a set of values that put money first over people, that a misguided view of the way that markets work. It was an economic philosophy that had been actually disproven by economic theory over the preceding 30 years, and yet it persisted. And so we have to construct and disseminate an alternative view of society, of our economy, of the nature of the human being, and what our values are. Obviously, I don't have time here to articulate that, but an important part of that is obviously a recognition that collective action is important. There is a need for solidarity. There is a need for trust, and that we can all do better by working together. Now, I want to spend just a minute talking about, when we say together, that we're talking about the whole world. Obviously, we're all focused at this moment on national policies, but we won't solve the problem of the pandemic until we've solved it everywhere. And we won't get a robust global recovery until we have a global recovery everywhere. And the kind of vaccine nationalism that we've seen that Trump has been trumpeting is not the way to go. The intellectual property, the ideas that are being produced to respond to the pandemic need to be globally available. The scientists around the world have been working together cooperatively, putting aside the normal concerns about who's first to publish, as they work together collectively to find the therapeutics, the tests, the diseases that will protect us against the pandemic. But in spite of that, governments and private pharmaceutical industries have a different agenda, maximizing their profits, protecting their own citizens without a sense of prioritization for the well-being of the world. One aspect of this global recovery that we are going to need has to do with debt. Again, John talked about the problems of debt within countries, they're enormous. But what we are, as the international community, are going to be facing in the coming months, year, 2 years, is a rash of debt crises. Some are already on us: Ecuador, Lebanon, Argentina. And the private sector has shown itself to be as greedy as it showed itself in 2008, as short-sighted, without lacking moral values. And they pretend that the pandemic doesn't exist. They've not even recognized how it affects the country's ability to pay. So there is going to have to be concerted efforts around the world. While the rest of the world was put on hold, the finance continued to collect interest and double interest, charging interest on interest. We are also going to need, we have tools, and use all those tools, including the issuance of special drawing rights that will be essential. Domestically, we need to go beyond the philosophy to get programmatic. And when I think about programs, I think about both expenditure policies, I think about economic programs, the end of austerity. It was a disaster in the UK, and it's been a disaster in every place that it's been tried. But it also goes to the rules. the rules of the economy. These were rewritten in the era of neoliberalism to provide more scope for exploitation, market power, and undermine the power of workers. So those rules all have to be rewritten as we claim the future, and rewritten in ways that support all the citizens of our societies. The specific program that John mentioned is actually worth thinking about for a moment. The care industry, especially long-term care for the aged. It was not just in the UK where turning this over to the private sector was a mistake. In Sweden, which we normally think of as a social democracy, a welfare state, it was privatized, and the private sector focus was on saving money, regardless of the effect it had on lives. And the same thing is true in the United States. So in a way, what COVID-19 has done to those living in nursing homes could not illustrate better the dangers of an economy that does not have adequate regulation, that turns over to the private sector the care of those who can't protect and fend for themselves. And so in a way, it is emblematic of the kinds of reforms, changes that we are going to have if we are going to claim the future. So in conclusion, let me say there's a long agenda ahead. COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses in our society. We have to save the planet. We have to save our people. And I'm looking forward to the agenda of Claim the Future to give us some guidance on how we can do that.
Joe, thanks very much for that. That was really incisive, and thanks for bringing your expertise to our conversations this evening and in the future. I'm really grateful. That was really helpful. I'll move swiftly on to our next speaker, as we're limited on time. Our next speaker is, well, some of you will have seen her. She was with us last year when we held our International Social Forum, and she spoke at that. She's a good friend, Jayati Ghosh. Jayati is one of the world's leading economists specializing in development economics. She chairs the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, where her core areas of study include international economics, employment patterns in developing countries, macroeconomic policy, and issues related to gender and development. Jayati is, well, she's not shied away from criticism of government and policymakers when needed, expressing her view that political dogmas that discourage public spending and are dangerous to the economy and destabilizing to society. She's been quite courageous in outspokenness in quite difficult political circumstances at times. I'm so proud of her. We're honored to have her join us from New Delhi this evening. Jayati.
Thank you so much, John. It's such a pleasure and such a privilege to be with all of you here. And I really, I'm absolutely delighted to be in something that has this really positive agenda. And I think already you and Joe have set the stage so well and have clarified all the main points so well that I don't have that much to add. So what I want to do is pick on some of the things that both of you have mentioned, but highlighting something a little bit even more immediate. I think we shouldn't just claim the future, we should prevent them from grabbing the present, which is happening right now. And let me explain what I mean by that. We all know, I think people across the world know that we cannot go back to what we had, and we can't do business as usual, and we can't make the mistakes that we made after the 2008 crisis. But governments don't seem to know that. And especially, I think some of our governments, the ones that are not doing so well in dealing with the virus, which all happen to be led by sort of, aggressive megalomaniac macho men with authoritarian tendencies, but with not very high levels of competence in terms of managing either health issues or the economy. And yet, despite all of those limitations, they're not being held back at the present. So I think one of my concerns right now is that I think, there is a wonderful group of people emerging across the world who have an excellent positive agenda. Some of it is very detailed, some of it has been already laid out very well. And I think I've seen some of the papers that are being produced here, that they're really inspiring and good and excellent. But we have to first begin by stopping the harm. And that's going on as we speak. They're not stopping the virus, they're not stopping the infections, but they are going on with their agenda nonetheless. And I think it's very important for us to combine our vision for the future with our ability to stop the rot right now as well, and to actually move forward in a way in which whatever happens right now, even during the pandemic, is not going to completely distort our possibilities for the future. I want to highlight 5 different ways, or 5 or 6 different ways in which I think this matters in terms of what's happening right now. And I think all of these, of course, I'm in India and I have very much a kind of developing country perspective on these things. But a lot of these things depend hugely on international solidarity, on what people in the North do. And a lot of them also will affect people in the North eventually, if not right now. So Joe already highlighted this. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last few months is that in the advanced world, you've had major fiscal impetus. You've had very, very large fiscal packages, not all of which are very equal, some of which disproportionately give corporate bailouts and so on, but nonetheless, they've been very large. In most developing countries, it hasn't been that way. Very few have done fiscal spending of more than 2 or 3% of GDP. In India, it's only around 1%. In many other countries, it's not even that. And that's partly because they are caught still in this dogma of austerity. But it's also because many of them simply don't have that fiscal space. And the debt issues that Joe mentioned are very much part of that. Now, absolutely, we need to do something about the global debt, but it's not something distant. 90% of private debt is contracted in London or New York. And it's those laws which determine whether developing countries can actually get a fair deal. So Argentina and Ecuador are being held to ransom by rogue bondholders because they're using laws of the US and the UK. If there's enough outcry here that you will not allow this to happen, there could be some pressure to actually prevent this obscene sort of attempt to basically prevent developing countries from being able to move on at all, and adding to this burden of debt, as Joe mentioned, interest on interest and so on. So debt relief, but it shouldn't be presented as relief. It should really be presented as one of those force majeure things. It's events beyond your control, which mean you cannot pay, and you therefore cannot be made to pay. But also that these are laws that are being pushed by systems that are developed in London and New York. And so those of you in London and New York, if you make a lot of noise, maybe something can be done about that. Second is about revival measures. So as I said, developing countries, they're not even doing fiscal stimulus. So what are they doing? They're so desperate to get growth back on track anyhow. I can say this for my own country, but it's true in a bunch of other developing countries, that they are willing to do all kinds of things which are completely against any kind of a positive agenda that we are thinking of. So they are encouraging all the most dirty investment, all the carbon emitting fossil fuel industries are being given massive concessions. They're deregulating environment, they're deregulating labor markets. In India, 4 states declared that they were going to do away with all labor laws, do away with the 8-hour day, do away with a holiday per week, do away with minimum wages, etc., to attract foreign capital. They're getting rid of all kinds of regulations that provided minimum protection to workers, to people, to the environment, and so on, in this desperate attempt to grow at any cost. And who's funding this? Well, global multinational banks, most of whom are headquartered again in the north. So we need conditionality for bailouts. We need to prevent the deregulations that are going to make things much, much worse. And we need to actually ensure that whatever happens now in these few months doesn't completely destroy the possibility. I mean, or will take much, much longer for us to rebuild if they succeed in these plans. The third thing is that, there's still no respect for care workers. We would have thought, right? It's a no-brainer. This is a massive health epidemic. The people on the front lines are all care workers, dominantly women, but all kinds of the more marginalized in society who are out there facing the music, doing all the terrible work, putting themselves at danger. Everybody sings for them, claps for them, etc., etc. But they're still treated badly. They're still not paid. Many countries, in India, doctors, nurses, sanitation workers haven't been paid for months because our governments are fiscally strained. We're not the only ones. This is true in parts of Africa. This is true in some Latin American countries. So, and we all see how Boris Johnson thinks of care workers, the same ones that he is busy thanking after he's recovered from COVID. He's then telling them that they have to pay higher immigration fees and so on. So we still have to make sure that care work gets its due. And it's not something in the future. We have to do it now. We have to make sure that care work and investment, public investment in care, because Joe mentioned this, the minute you privatize it, it's all about profit. It's all about cutting costs. It's not anymore about a basic public provision that should be universal and good quality. Fourth thing is intellectual property. And again, Joe mentioned this. Of course, the most egregious and obscene reflection of it right now is with the drugs. But what's really interesting is that the COVID vaccine is the one that gets all this attention, or some of the drugs that are mentioned that are supposed to be treated. And of course, whenever Mr. Trump thinks something works, then he demands that the US buys up the global supplies of it and so on. But those are, if you like, even relatively minor. The whole system of intellectual property rights that is allowing these multinational corporations to rush through with trying to produce it first in order to bag massive profits at the expense of governments. Because the whole idea is that they will be able to charge these very high prices and then governments will buy it up for their people. But a lot of that is still the result of public research, which is then used and exploited at the sort of last mile by private companies that then get these patents and do massive profiteering on them. But what is worse is that this kind of IPR is being pushed as we speak in all of the trade deals that are still being negotiated. India's on the verge of negotiating a trade deal with the US, which has got horrible intellectual property clauses. The UK is keen on negotiating a deal with India, which again has really bad intellectual property clauses. So it's actually being pushed even more, even as we speak. We know that, I hear that today in your parliament, the MPs have effectively allowed bits of the NHS to be sold off to foreigners. Maybe I got it wrong, but it clearly the governments are not, shall we say, abashed by the current situation to think that they must actually push back or prevent themselves from doing these things. So we have to be out there preventing them. People have to be out there saying, no, we will not allow this at a time like this. And then finally, there's this whole issue of how governments, certainly mine, but I think many more, have used this period of the pandemic to massively increase digital surveillance and to enable a kind of excessive reliance on digitalization that is adding to all the other kinds of divides that we have, the other kinds of inequality. The digital divide, you can imagine how severe it is in developing countries, but it's pretty big in many developed countries as well. And what's happening now is that there is globally a much greater acceptance among citizens of the fact that you can give your data to the state, because after all, it's for public health purposes. And there's less scrutiny of what the state does with that data. there is much more reliance on digital techniques for education, for all kinds of things, which hugely increase inequality among students, among learners at all levels, and so on. And there's much less scrutiny of state action because the pandemic has actually enabled a degree of lack of accountability of the state, which again would have been unprecedented in the past. I think all of these are things that need not happen. So I think we have to definitely claim the future, but we also have to grab the present. Because if we don't grab the present, it's going to be so much harder and it takes so much longer to actually grab the future as well. Okay, let me stop here. Thanks.
Jayati, thank you very much for that. That was inspiring, particularly about the role that we have to play in the UK, but also your statement, and I'll just quote, people have to say no, we have to be out there, or we have to be out there together, and we will. Our next speaker is a friend of mine, Tina Natter. Tina is, some of you will have met her at our International Social Forum as well last year, where she made an incredible speech intervention. It was terrific. Tina is a Ngati Puro mother of two from the east coast of New Zealand. Her work involves advocacy for environmental, indigenous and human rights. This includes, I'll just go through it because it's quite extensive. It's about local, national, international initiatives that highlight the role of settler colonialism, looking at issues such as the exploitation of indigenous lands, of climate change and waste pollution, and promoting indigenous conservation as best practice for a globally sustainable future. And she set out a whole range of initiatives in our International Social Forum last year. In 2018, Tina, she laid a complaint at the UN over the 250th anniversary commemorations of Captain Cook on the grounds, I just find this brilliant, that the narrative and presentation of New Zealand's colonialisation underpinned the denial of Indigenous rights. She's recently published a book of her essays on resisting colonial fictions. It just has so much resonance with regard to what's happening in this country as a result of the Black Lives Matter campaign, about actually in this country having that debate about Britain's colonial history. So it's just an honour to have Tina speaking to us from New Zealand this evening. Welcome, Tina.
Kia ora, and thank you very much, John, for the invite. I'm also very honoured to be sharing this time with you all and speaking to this really exciting project that's being launched this evening. I guess where I would like to start is just an acknowledgement that, science has indicated to us now, is acknowledged that COVID-19 is caused but also sustained by human excessiveness. So our intensive global food systems, our animal trade, the loss of biodiversity, climate change, and the loss of animal habitats are all now clearly linked to viruses which cross over from the animal world into humankind and subsequently turn into pandemics. But it's also our excessiveness that sustains the virus and exacerbates its impact. So globalized economies, air pollution, poverty, economic compulsiveness, individualistic attitudes, all of these are behaviors that maintain COVID-19 transmission rates and subsequently mortality rates. So, we know that COVID-19 is caused and maintained by human excessiveness now. And our vulnerability, therefore, is of our own making. And we do have the power to change these things, but we also know that there are varying levels of agency and power to be able to effect that change, as well as varying levels of vulnerability to COVID-19 as well. And that is because, empire has shaped globally our way of interacting with each other and the planet in a hierarchical fashion. Empire has hierarchically apportioned power and empire has hierarchically apportioned resources. And the consequences of that is a system that has hierarchical levels of COVID-19 impact. And so, as has been pointed out time and time again over the past 6 months or longer, COVID-19 is a kind of a doppelganger for climate change. And what it's done is that it's brought the impacts of our actions right up to our faces in a way that we can't evade, the way that in which we've evaded our climate responsibilities. And as you've already pointed out, John, you know, COVID-19 is vast and it's terrible, but it is not an extinction level event. Climate change is an extinction level event. And if we can recognize COVID-19 as a kind of a mirror, it can show us some important truths about ourselves, and those truths can help us to avoid the extinction level event that is climate change. And, you know, one of those truths is that we have become, over time, very, very good at articulating goals, which we then don't achieve. We set underwhelming emissions reduction targets, and then we don't meet them. We set sustainability development goals and we fail to achieve them. And we keep asking why that is. And it doesn't. It's also, you know, that poses a challenge also to the global Green New Deal. But if you apply the lens of empire to our global systems, it becomes very apparent very soon why we have been failing to meet those goals. So imperialism is by its nature inhumane. A part of its process is to dehumanize in order for it to dispossess. The systems through which these goals and targets must travel in order to be recognized and implemented and achieved, those processes at the moment are deeply imperialist in nature. And so those systems are incapable of achieving humanitarian ideals. There's 3 points that I want to make really crystal clear here. One is that we must face the lessons of COVID-19 as a matter of survival. 2, that the flaws that are exposed by COVID-19 are fundamentally crafted by imperialism. And 3, because imperialism is inhumane in nature, it must be understood and exposed and rejected in order for us to achieve humanitarian goals. So one thing that happened here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I know it happened in many Indigenous places around the world, is that we set up checkpoints around our community as a matter of survival because colonialism made us vulnerable to COVID-19. And that act of survival was characterized as vigilantism and insurgency against the state. And that is a very obvious manifestation of, you know, the intersection between imperialism and COVID-19. But, you know, there are plenty of examples, and Jayati, you know, listed quite a few of them, but whole nations are laboring under economic imperialism. Their resources have been extracted for hundreds of years by European imperial powers, and they've been chained down by debt that's been established under the same imperial economic system so that they can't afford to effectively respond to COVID-19 or climate change or any other crisis really that besets them. And that kind of imperialism is being maintained by international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And so we're already seeing, and again, this is, you know, these are things that Jayati touched upon as well, ways in which imperialism is seeking to exploit COVID through the exploitation of Uyghur workers in PPE factories in China, and the way in which corporate food systems are exploiting community need by perpetuating dependency rather than supporting food sovereignty, and how plastics industries are exploiting emergency systems and perpetuating falsehoods about the necessity of single-use plastics for COVID protection and applying for COVID bailouts alongside the fossil fuel industry in general, when the truth is that they were flailing before the COVID crisis anyway. So It's also vitally important for us to understand these mechanisms of imperialism and injustice, because it plays a huge role in the distrust of governments, and that is being manipulated by the global right at the moment. You know, the climate crisis spanned both center-right and center-left governments around the world, in the US and the UK and here in Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. Homelessness and wealth divides and resource wars have spanned both sides of the political spectrum, and the inability for imperial governments to be able to confront their complicitness and their roles in that, to confront the brokenness of that political system, has really muddied the waters for who is the lesser evil and who has the moral high ground here. And it's created a context where what little power the populace has is able to be manipulated by imperialist media, so that we wind up voting against our own best interests. And we've seen that in the UK, and we've seen that in the USA and in Australia as well. So we really need to identify these systems of injustice and imperialism and reject them in our aspirations to build a just new normal. And we can't allow in that space for imperialist systems to be the ones that define the scope of injustice. So if you're interested in justice, then this is what it's going to take. It's going to take, at a transnational, international level, a new relational model, one that recognizes the independent rights of Indigenous peoples, one that is committed to reversing the long-standing imperial injustice visited upon the global South, one that supports the rights of grassroots movements for self-determination. That is what you will champion if you are interested in justice and rights and humanitarianism. And so this, to an extent, requires us to hold a radical belief in ourselves and our humanity. Empire relies upon a number of fictions to be able to maintain its power. One is the fiction of benevolence, I should say. It likes to position itself as the benefactor of humanity, so that we believe that we need it. And it also includes convincing us of its inevitability, that it's impossible to dismantle and impossible to do without. So along with those fictions, it also requires a machine to manufacture them in different forms and to constantly push it out and repeat it around us all the time. And so it becomes a really deeply radical act for us to continue to hold faith in ourselves and our humanity and our ability to overcome this. But we must do that. We must undertake those radical acts of hope and self-belief, to reject the poverty of the mind and the austerity of the heart, and to believe in our own humanity to the point where we invest in it. We invest in these systems of social love, invest in ourselves and our own potential, and love ourselves back into greatness, to let the planet also love us again. And I'm going to wrap this up, but I just wanted to say, you know, my beautiful friend and poet, Carlo Mila, she says, you know, the planet, she loves us. She wants to provide for us, but we keep hurting her. Water loves us too. She wants so desperately to be abundant for us, to heal us and to cleanse us, but we keep killing her and hurting her. And we've seen that. We saw that in COVID, the abundance that water can and the planet can get back to if we stop hurting them. And so around the world, you know, we have these pockets of communities who are just going ahead and doing it. They're just taking control back and they're claiming their own futures. And where that's happening, we need to support that. And we also need to grow those responses. But importantly, for transnational issues like climate change, like globally just economies, like plastic pollution and the global Green New Deal, we need to model ourselves upon these grassroots ideals of collective responsibilities and communal well-being and relationship regeneration, these radical acts of love and belief in humanity. So I'm going to wind it up there on those positive words. Thank you, John.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Thank you so much. I'll quote you I'll quote you if you don't mind, and the number of speeches that I can, and on that phrase, the radical act of hope and the radical act of love. I find that just remarkable. Thank you for that. That's really, 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 I just think a major contribution to our discussions and the direction we'll take and the way in which we'll articulate our arguments. Thank you for that. Our final speaker is Assad Raymond. Many of you will know Assad for his work on a whole range of issues and fronts. And Assad is a climate justice activist who works with a whole range of movements and frontline communities in the global south. He's more than 25 years experience in NGOs. As the executive director of the global charity War on Want, now he organizes to put an end to poverty and injustice. And previously as the head of international climate, Friends of the Earth, Assad served on the boards of Amnesty International UK, Friends of the Earth International, Global Justice Now, and one of my favorites, the Newer Monitoring Project. We met years ago. Assad refers to climate change, I think quite rightfully, as the fight of our lives. And he believes that fair solutions to climate change that are fair are also the exact solutions needed to tackle economic inequality. I'm really delighted Assad was able to join us this evening, because he's been one of the strongest voices within the UK on bringing climate justice in connection with social justice. Assad, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John, and it's a pleasure. And I think I need to send you a better bio. That part of it sounded, definitely could sound much more exciting. It's always a challenge to follow such great comrades as Jayati and Tina and Joe, and of course yourself. So I just wanted to start by quoting a few words. COVID is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all, the fiction that unpaid care work is not work, the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, the myth that we're in the same boat. These are not the words of John or Bernie or Angela Davis. They're the words of the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, that noted left-wing radical, in a speech he made over the weekend. And I think those words show that this time is ripe for progressives, not just to tinker around the edges, but for us to articulate a bold and radical vision, a vision that really throws off the shackles of neoliberalism, one that allows us to imagine a different reality and a different world to the one we inhabit. As Tina touched upon, it's said that one of neoliberalism's biggest crimes was that it stole the ability of people to imagine and dream. And it's true that many in the centre-left progressive circles in the global north simply internalized neoliberal values and principles. For them, the market was king. All we could ever do was tinker around the edges. They believed nothing came before it and nothing would come after it. After all, it was the end of history. They've even tried to take away the stories of our struggles, our resistance, and our victories, even as movements took to the streets across the global south, from Chile, Lebanon to Iraq, calling not for just changes in individual policies, but for deep systemic change. We all remember the slogan in Chile, "This is not about 30 cents, but about 30 years," as the movements there brought together the labor movement, feminists, environmentalists, and the dispossessed. But in the global north, some continue to spin this lie that change can only come about if we triangulate to the right, make a devil's pact to accept the logic of the right on immigration and racism, so we could potentially win some progress on economic or climate justice issues. Or even the bigger lie that economic liberalization would inevitably bring some form of social justice or human rights globally. This is the moment for us this moment calls out for us not only to be bold and radical, it actually calls out for us to anchor our vision in justice, connecting the solutions to the multiple crises that we face. And for that vision of justice, it has to be internationalist in scope, and that it has to be anchored in an understanding that we don't want to build back. Back is not where we want to go. We need to dial forward to something better. And for that, our solutions can't retreat behind the walls of the nation state. They have to be global and universal. And it said that that vision, and it has to be that that vision has to address the permanent crisis by the global south. You've heard it from Tina, you've heard it from Jayati and everybody else, not just of the corona pandemic or the existing crisis of neoliberal inequality and the upcoming global recession, or the crime or the crisis of climate injustice, or from racism and patriarchy, but also the legacy of empire and racialized capitalism. We have to recognize that the decades of neoliberal policies and the decades of austerity that we find ourselves in sit in an arc of exploitation whose logic can be traced through time. Whether you start from slavery, go through to colonialism, imperialism, to capitalism, it's a logic that has been willing to sacrifice people, especially those with black or brown skin, working people, women, and the most marginalized, and of course, our planet, its life systems and the environment that so much of the world relies on in the pursuit of one thing, profit for the few. And so to do that, I think we have to recognize some truths about our vision, its political demands, and our understanding of the fight we're in and how and the need for us to build collective power. The reality is, of course, that the global pandemic, the corona pandemic, has already provided us an insight in what the response to these crises will be. They'll be anything but global. We've seen a retreat to the nation state with competition between rich and poor countries for access to scarce health resources. We've seen health and economic inequalities determine people's survival rates. We've seen workers in the global south, as John mentioned, garment workers left destitute. We've seen large numbers of people left hungry. We've seen migrants forced to walk hundreds and thousands of kilometers in search of safety. We've seen the dead left unburied in the streets in Ecuador, and the poorest and most vulnerable left without any support from the state. Why? Because the global north, our banks, our corporations, our governments, and the institutions, whether it's the World Bank to the IMF, have systematically hollowed out the ability of the global south to meet the needs of its people. Structural adjustment programs have destroyed public services, privatized health provision, and prevented countries from using the same tools that the global north has used to protect their economies and societies, and failed to protect their local food production, and created economies designed for one thing only: commodity exports that are in the hands of multinationals. And of course, the worst is yet to come. The upcoming recession that is going to affect both the global north and the global south is predicted to lead to a loss of up to half of all jobs in the global south. This is a reality where already half the world's population are struggling to survive on less than $5 a day. Billions without access to food, without access to energy, without access to water, and millions more being pushed into extreme poverty with little or no social protection available. And of course, as we've heard from Jayati, corporations and right-wing governments are already looking to roll back hard-won labor rights in the name of competitiveness and rebuilding and growing the economy. So our demands have to be that we must demand a guaranteed basic income, a living wage, universal public services, social protection and workers' rights for all, both in the UK and globally, connecting our demands there. John mentioned the climate crisis, and of course, the global south is in a moment of permanent crisis, a permanent crisis that is being worsened by the climate crisis. Killer storms, floods, droughts are leading to a collapse in food production, access to fresh water, the loss of livelihoods, forced displacement of people, and economic losses, which, states are literally struggling to deal with and unable to meet the costs of. I mean, the IPCC, the climate scientists, estimate that the economic cost of the climate crisis will be up to about 70 trillion in a 2-degree world. And we're entering, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Philip Alston, said, we're about to create a climate apartheid, where the rich will seek safety whilst leaving the poor to die. So our solutions must be therefore anchored in a commitment to keep temperatures well below 1.5 degrees. And that means rich countries doing their fair share of effort. And in the UK, that doesn't mean genocidal targets of 2050 or banking on imaginary solutions that are going to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. As War on Want, we've done some research and calculated that the UK's fair share of effort would be close to zero by 2030 and $1 trillion in transfers to the global south just to meet its fair share of mitigation efforts. So that means that we not have to shift away from fossil fuels, but we have to take a dramatic step by making food and clean energy a public good to be shared equitably and not for exploitation by big business. We have to demand that land rights for indigenous people and peasants and farmers who feed 80% of the world on just 24% of land. Neither can the global north talk about a green recovery or green stimulus predicated on doubling devastating resource extraction in the global south. The answer simply won't be found in electric batteries. It has to be found in asking that profound question, what is our economy for? And so having a justice transition to build the care economy of the future. And as Jayati and Josh already mentioned, of course we must demand, both for the poor in the global north and for countries in the global south who are facing a devastating debt crisis as they struggle already to deal with the crisis of inequality and corona, not just to have their debts postponed, but to be cancelled outright. 46 of the lowest income countries already spending more on their debt service than they do on their healthcare systems. But I think we should be calling for much more. We should be calling for reparations. Reparations, not just for the £8 billion that was made from enslaving African people and is invested in every brick and mortar in this country, but reparations for the 45 trillion looted from India alone during the Raj, or the 16 trillion that's flowed in capital flows that have gone from the global south to the global north, the trillions that have been secreted away in tax havens governed by the UK, and the 4.5 trillion that has been taken in debt repayments. I think we have to educate people that we don't need charity appeals. What we need is economic justice. We know that capitalism globally is facing a much greater shock than it did in the 2008 financial crisis. And in the face of these multiple crises, the very foundations of neoliberal capitalism are being questioned. But I think we have to also be honest with ourselves that what comes next is by no means something that will be fairer, more equitable or greener. If we look at it, the proponents of neoliberalism are already promoting their new vision of disaster capitalism, which is going to deepen the existing inequalities between the global north and south. The far right are already mobilizing around a mantra of walls and fences and nativism in the face of these global crises. And of course, the military industrial complex already talks about we need a security and militarized response to these crises. One we can see replicated already, whether it's in the US, Israel, India, the Philippines, and of course, in the Mediterranean. So our call to claim the future has to be located around a radical global Green New Deal, one that connects our struggles and our movements, and that guarantees everyone the right to a dignified life and a planet that is safe for both this and future generations. For that, we need to talk about how do we build our collective power? How do we act in solidarity? And how do we rebuild anti-imperialism and internationalism? And how do we mobilize our movements from Black Lives Matter to the climate strikers to the labor movement around a narrative of jobs, justice and climate, building our power and targeting both the recession, but also our responsibility as movements in the UK, that the global summits of the G7 and the COP26 that the UK is hosting in 2021. This is an exciting venture and a much needed conversation. It's also really important in this conversation that, as I said, we rebuild internationalism. We rebuild our vision of anti-imperialism. Only when we act together globally will we build sufficient power to transform the world that we want. Thank you.
Thanks, Assad. Thank you very much. It's a major contribution to our thinking. Some people have asked us, submitted a number of questions to us. We've got a very limited amount of time left, about 10 minutes. So one of the key questions links up to what Assad has just raised, this issue about power and how do we go from here to secure this vision that we have for society, particularly focused around the Green New Deal. This is the question that came in. I think it was Brian Murphy who submitted it. It was, how do we get our hands on the levers of power in order to implement the changes that need to be made in response to the pandemic? If I can just ask each of the panelists, they can just focus on that for a couple of minutes before before we end. Jayati, can I start with you?
Okay. Yes, thank you. That's a tough one. You know, I think what has happened to many of us is that electoral defeats in our countries has kind of made us slightly defeated in terms of being able to change anything in our countries and in our societies and politics. And it does seem sometimes, certainly I know it feels like that in India, when every institution seems to have collapsed. I think in the UK and the US, you still have pushback from courts or from some other areas. Here, it seems like everything has collapsed. Yet, we find that they still can't get away with everything. So, of course, electoral, processes matter crucially in terms of getting hold of the lever of power, at least in formal democracies and so on. But I think we cannot underestimate the role of popular protest. And I say this because in India, dealing as we are with an authoritarian, fascist, deeply polarizing kind of state, we still managed to prevent an attempt to bring in a new citizenship law that would have given Muslims second-class status. And that was because of that whole upswell of protest across the country in all kinds of ways. And they have not admitted that that's the reason, but that's really the reason. Yesterday was the last day for them to frame the rules for that law. They didn't do it, so the law has lapsed. And this we did in spite of the fact that they control every institution at this point. So I think we cannot forget the power of public protest. And I think however much states try and prevent it, and they certainly are, they're arresting all the peaceful protesters as we speak. I mean, my students, my friends are being arrested around me all the time. They still can't prevent it completely. And they still are forced to actually bow to that public opinion. So I think our challenge really is to mobilize that public opinion. I think that's really how we finally get our hands on the levers of power.
Yeah, I absolutely support everything Jayati said. Obviously, you know, I'm a big advocate for public action as well. I think another area that we can look to also is, you know, where those levers currently sit, we can hold those people accountable for the barriers to justice that are being maintained in that space. So as you mentioned, as Assad mentioned earlier, you know, he quoted Antonio Guterres in the United Nations, but there are many barriers to justice that sit within the United Nations as an international institution as well. And, you know, as an Indigenous person, a perfect example is the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that is an amazing document that was put together by Indigenous elders and leaders over a long time. It is a blueprint for humanity. It is 45 articles of amazing declarations and discussions and commitments to food sovereignty, to our cultural and our spiritual rights and our territorial rights. And if those things were able to be secured, I'd probably not be sitting here having this discussion. But you know, the only reason that that wound up getting passed as a declaration is that the 46th article got put in, which subjugated all of those rights under the rights of empire and settler colonial states, and so that none of those articles can be enacted in a way that subverts the right of the colonial states that creates all of those problems in the first place. And so those are some of the barriers to this justice that need to be exposed, and particularly within these international institutions that enjoy the esteem of being these paternal benefactors of the world. And so if they are going to hold that esteem of being paternal benefactors of the world, we need to discuss the way in which those levers of justice or injustice are being wielded in those spaces. That's a very low-hanging fruit for us to be able to also share those levers of injustice. So yeah, that's one of the things I would add to what Jayati has said that I completely agree with about social action.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. I'm afraid John has lost his connection. So can I ask Joe Stiglitz if you would mind asking the question next, and we'll get John back as soon as we can. Thanks so much. Okay, so we're not sure that Joe can get on either. So Assad, I'm going to come to you if you don't mind answering that question.
Sure.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think it's one of the most important questions for our movement. So I suppose I want to just touch on maybe two positive things first. I mean, if we think about just in the global north in the last year and a half, the impact that the climate strikers, young people have had, they've done more to mainstream radical demands around climate justice than 30 years of NGO campaigning. If we look at what's happened with the Black Lives Matter protests, both in the US and globally, to have a national conversation in the US about defunding the police and investing in public services in youth provision and mental health, that's the power of those political movements. Those movements didn't wait for political parties to make demands. They created the space, and political parties had to respond to power of those movements. So think about here in the UK, we've had the most profound conversation about race and empire and colonialism. So because of the Black Lives Matter protests in this country, how do we turn that protest, not just about kicking over statues, but actually kicking over the economy as we know it? Well, that means we definitely know, yes, we have to build movement power, but for movement power, you need organizational structure. We know you need organizations within it. You need political education so that we can educate people and make sure that we're transforming people's consciousness about both understanding the context we're in and the vision for the future. We need a vision. We all know that if you want to transform society, you have to have a vision of the society you want to be able to talk about. You can't just be saying, no, what are we demanding? All social transformation has happened when people have been able to articulate a powerful vision. And of course, you need political demands, because you need political demands to have political fights. Because through the process of political fights, we build consciousness, we build unities between movements, we build consciousness of class and race and gender. And so we have to have some fights, and there are enough. I think the problem is not that there aren't enough political fights, but how do we make sure that we fight the right fights? And I just want to end by saying, you know, for some of us who were on the streets in Seattle all those decades ago, you know, there was a moment where we were able to bring the labor movement, the environment, the global justice movements, farmers and peasants, political parties out on the streets to, you know, opposition to the WTO. And that was a very, very powerful moment. But what it did, it transformed politics globally as well. It shifted civil society. It shifted the anchor of the debate. That's what we've got to do in this moment. So that's, I think, the prerequisite to being able to seize the levers of power. Only when we have a powerful social movement do you make political parties respond to our demands.
Assad, thank you very much. I'm sorry my internet connection went down, so I just came back only a few minutes ago to hear the final responses. Do you know, someone had an idea about establishing broadband right the way across the UK, and it should be for free. I wonder who that was. Well, it's certainly needed at the moment because private providers are letting us down continuously. I'm hoping that everyone has had a chance to respond to the question. I want to just say this. I want to thank all the speakers
for their contribution this evening. I think it's been a terrific debate and discussion. Can I urge people, this I think could be a very successful and exciting initiative, Claim the Future. If you want to participate, please go to our website, sign in, let us have your details, and we'll make sure that you're invited to our further discussions, and also to ensure that in the actions that follow from those discussions, we're working together, exactly as the speakers have said, how we can mobilize popular power to bring about the change that we need and create the society, I think, that we all desire. So I'd like to thank Joe, I'd like to thank Jayati, I'd like to thank Natter, and I'd also like to thank Assad, but also thank the team that have organized this evening. We've had a fantastic turnout, both in terms of Zoom, but also following on Facebook as well. We'll keep you informed via the website and via direct communications as best we can about our future activities and discussions. Also, if you can help us at all in terms of funding, there's the opportunity to make a contribution on the website as well. But above all else, I just want to thank you for coming along tonight, listening to the discussions, thank all the speakers, and just thank you for your commitment. This is a pivotal political moment. We've got to seize this opportunity. We've got to claim the future. Thank you.